Welcome everyone to this incredibly special. Sorry, I'm trying to get my view here. This very incredible special session of Wednesday. We have Nicholas Pearson, who is a dear friend of mine, Kathleen's, and Kelly's. Kelly first met Nicholas quite a few years ago at a conference, and then I invited Nicholas to join Kathleen and I at CARE. I think it was in 2019. And Nicholas was so generous. He responded right away and he joined us there. And it was so wonderful. So I thought I'd do something a little bit different so you all could kind of get a peek at what Nicholas is like. I'm going to be sharing his bio, but while I'm doing that, I am going to share a little slideshow of some photos of Nicholas from CARE, because he's gone to CARE ever since 2019. He even co-taught an animal Reiki for Reiki practitioners class with me out there, and he's taken the level 3 as well there. So he's got a lot of time out there at CARE, and I thought you might enjoy these photos. So I'm going to share my screen. And Nicholas, I think you're unmuted. If you could unmute and just tell me if you can see my screen, that would be great. If you can see the slideshow.
Looks great.
Perfect. Okay. So let me get this started. Oh, wait, is that back all the way? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. So Nicholas Pearson is a teacher and practitioner of Usui Reiki Ryoho. He began his Reiki journey in 2006 and is trained in both traditional Japanese and Western forms of Reiki practice. Certified as both a medical Reiki Master and a Let Animals Lead animal Reiki practitioner and teacher, he currently serves on the board of directors of Shelter Animal Reiki Association and formerly served on the advisory council for the National Reiki and Healthcare Certification Initiative. He is also a member of the International Association of Reiki Professionals, Shibumi International Reiki Association, and the Reiki Healing Association. His seminal Reiki book, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, a manual of Shoden and Okuden, is available in English and Italian. Nicholas also offers seminars on crystal healing, Reiki, and flower essence therapy online and around the world. He is the author of 10 books and lives in Orlando, Florida. So I just want to go back to this beautiful slideshow that we have here. Oh my gosh, and I lost it. Why can't I get back to it? Oh my gosh, you guys. So sorry. I have technical difficulties here on my part. So I wanted to end the slideshow with this cute picture of Nicholas, and this is Rocket the raccoon. Rocket, this was at the end of, this was actually the first time that Nicholas had been to CARE. And we were just ending our day. We had shared Reiki with some of the animals. Kristen had given us a tour and we were saying goodbye to the animals. And so Nicholas went up to Rocket. So Rocket, it was really cool too, because Nicholas, all of the animals were just so connected to Nicholas. They loved being with him. And I'm sure that Rocket felt his energy from afar. So here Rocket is saying goodbye to Nicholas, and you can't see it, but Nicholas has a water bottle, a beautiful blue glass water bottle with crystals on the bottom of it. And so Rocket is connecting with Nicholas, and he sees his water bottle and he decides, I want this water bottle. He loved the crystals and he grabbed it from Nicholas, and we don't have a picture, but he actually got it away from Nicholas. And he had it in the cage with him, and we couldn't get it from him because he's a little bit of a rascal and he likes to scratch and bite. So one of the staff had to come over and try to trick him in an exchange for a higher valued item for the water bottle. And it took some trying, but we finally got the water bottle away, and it was so funny. So now we always tell everybody, hey, if you go by Rocket, be sure not to sit too closely or have anything shiny and sparkly. So, and I'm sure you saw the picture of Nicholas with the bear. That was a really special photograph because that was during the level 3 class, and Nicholas was doing a reiju on one of the students, and you could see that Lolo the bear was really into that beautiful moment. So thank you so much, Nicholas. And before I turn it over to him, I know you're dying to hear from him. But before I turn it over, I wanted to just turn it over to Kathleen and Kelly so they can just share a little personal message. So I'm not sure if you want to go first, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm not feeling well today, everybody, but I did want to be here because Nicholas is such a special person to SARA, and to all of us, not only for all the support that he has given to our work for animals, and especially shelter and sanctuary animals, of course, but also to the world of Reiki and his research and his beautiful book. If I don't know if you guys have read his book, but if not, be sure to get it. But just his thoughtfulness and openness and wisdom with the system of Reiki is something that's very special and we don't often see in the world today. And so we just feel so privileged to have Nicholas be part of our community. And he's going to be teaching a very rare class on the West Coast here in Marin County next month. And we still do have space. So please make sure to find out more about that. You can email me, email Leah, and we can send you the link to the page with more information for that. But a level 3 class in human Reiki, of course. And there is no other human Reiki teacher I can recommend more highly. And so I'm really hoping that we get a nice big group for his rare appearance here on the West Coast. And after today, you'll know why you want to study with him. So thank you so much for speaking on this very important topic, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And Kelly, I don't know if you want to say something as well.
Yeah, I just want to welcome Nicholas to this event, and I first read your book, I don't know, 2018 or 2017, whenever it came out. And I met Nicholas through the Vermont Reiki Association conference. He spoke at our conference here in Vermont, and then again, I was on a panel in Boston, and Nicholas was doing a talk there as well, and got to know him a little more over dinner. And just Nicholas is so knowledgeable about Reiki and its history, and such a great teacher. And I love being able to attend his, the workshops he does for us. And it's just wonderful. Like Kathleen said, I mean, if you want to study with a really knowledgeable and accessible Reiki teacher, Nicholas is the guy. And I'm always just so amazed at how much Nicholas accomplishes in his life. And if you don't know, he also plays the French horn, and he writes books about crystals and stones, and takes retreats and tours and everything. So I'm just shocked at how much he gets done. But Nicholas is just so knowledgeable, and you'll learn so much from this little workshop we're doing today. So thank you so much for being here, Nicholas.
Thank you, Kelly.
So without further ado, Nicholas, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So when Leah and I were chatting about this, we had a lot of ideas, and we landed on this topic of myths and misconceptions, fact versus fantasy in the Reiki world. It's one of my favorite topics to broach because we could spend, I don't know, several weeks rooting around and investigating some of the claims behind the practice, some of the historical details, where certain things come from, and we still wouldn't run out of topics. So I have like a few kind of bullet points in my head, and we'll cover as many as we can until Leah lets me know we're at time. And then we're going to open the floor for some Q&A. I don't have a very detailed PowerPoint presentation for every topic we're going to cover. Instead, I want to keep it more conversational and just kind of give you an idea of what it's like to dig deep and look for evidence. So before we really look at some of that, I want to just share a little bit about my personal ethos when it comes to studying anything, particularly in the system of Reiki. First and foremost, we want to go where we've got sources cited. We want to look and evaluate what those resources are. We want to compare and contrast. One of my big we'll say driving MOs is to seek contrary evidence, because the funny thing about humans is we're never all right or all wrong all of the time. Even when we're doing the best we can, we get some stuff wrong. And sometimes, even when we intend to make stuff up, we get a little bit of it right. And so through Reiki history in particular, which for much of its now century plus of history has been transmitted as primarily an oral tradition, we have this game of telephone where things have gotten distorted, where details were left out, omitted, changed on purpose, and people had to course correct and adapt in the moment. So for the most part, by and large, the key players in the preservation, the resurrection, the rewriting of Reiki history time and time again are mostly doing the best they can with the tools they had. My goal is never to, stand on the soapbox and say, you all got this wrong. Instead, what I like to do is say, let's look at how we got here. So that's kind of my goal in everything that I do, whether it's Reiki related, mineral related. I even do it in music because my great love is historical horn performance. So I play pre-modern instruments, which is super weird and specialized, but it's my love. So I love looking at how things evolve and develop. And I think no better place to start with the system of Reiki is how the word Reiki developed. Now, we have a nice handy dandy little translation, we're going to put that in air quotes for now, that we generally use in the Reiki community that may or may not be a very literal translation for the word Reiki. So I'm going to start with a little screen share here for us. My computer's lagging just a little bit, so I apologize if it takes a moment to get up there. So I imagine if you've opened a book or two of Reiki in your life, if you've had a good Reiki manual, you've probably seen these kanji before. If you've got a copy of my book, they're right on the cover, Reiki. And this is a word that is hard to render. It's very difficult to give us a nice little buzzword. So I'm sure most of us do what we learned from our teachers, who learned from their teachers, who learned from their teachers, and so on and so forth, to say that ki might mean something like life force, and rei can mean universal. So this is universal life force. And what we end up with is something that is not at all a literal translation. When we adapt a word, particularly something that is very abstract and outside of our normal kind of day-to-day concepts, and we have to render it in a way that is easy, kind of buzzwordy, we call that process of we'll say translation for now, creating a gloss. So gloss is never a literal translation. It's just an easy way to put something from one language into another. And oftentimes it implies layers of meaning that may or may not be part of the literal translation. So we're going to break this down into two parts, rei and ki. So rei is this really kind of abstract idea, and it is written in a very old style script. In fact, when we see the characters rei and ki written in this font, in this writing system, we call them kyujitai characters or old style writing. Japanese was simplified post World War II to improve literacy rates. So they made these characters have fewer strokes in them, so they're faster to write. But when we look at the kyujitai, the old style writing, we see its etymology preserved. And just like English words have etymology in them, just like we can, look up where words come from in earlier forms, we can do the same thing here. And so we have this really abstract concept that we can't draw a picture of. So this is not a pictograph, unlike many other kanji. Instead, we have something that is considered a logograph or an ideograph. It expresses an idea graphically, but it has to do so in kind of poetic terms. So we get these three words, these three root words that are kind of smushed together to make this big character. They are rain or ame, utsua, which means vessel or container, and miko, which we would originally render shaman. It has some other connotations in modern Japanese. And it basically depicts this idea that there is some quality that descends from the heavens, like rain, that fills us when we become this empty vessel or container, this passive receiver. And it is through this kind of spiritual action that the intermediaries of our praxis, our religious life, our spiritual journeys operate. So, thousands of years ago, when these characters were developed in mainland China, that was it was a shaman of that society. And now, of course, it has different, we'll say, layers of interpretation in modern society. And originally, this word depicted the act of prayer, the act of chanting to bring rain, to like propitiate the god's favor, to make something miraculous, mysterious, or awe-inspiring happen. It later took on the connotation of the process of the descent of that miracle, or that magic, or that energy, and then eventually began to mean that which descended itself, which most literally was the human soul. So if we go back to Usui's era before these characters were simplified, this word most frequently meant soul or spirit. They're interrelated terms, and even in English, we don't agree on what the difference is. But it can also refer to the energy, the ambience, the essential nature of something, the spirit of blank. It often has associations with things related to the ancestors, to funerary practices, and in more colloquial speech, it implies something wondrous, miraculous, mysterious, or awe-inspiring. So nowhere do we get the word universal as a literal translation. But because Rei is that quality that descends, it is almost as if it is depicting the immaterial being made concrete, and therefore can paint a picture of the whole universe, which is a little bit different than just universal. And next we get the word ki, which gives us, usually we're going to translate this as meaning energy or life force. It's the same word as qi in Chinese. It's sometimes used as a gloss for prana in Sanskrit, although we're going to see that gets complicated on the next slide. And it's made out of two of these little radicals or root words put together. Kigame, which means vapor or steam. And then the bottom one is the word kome, which is the rice plant itself. So kome is implying something that fuels us, like a nice meal would, but is intangible, like steam. It's hard to reach out and hold on to. It runs through your hands. It's invisible, although we can feel its activity. So this word ki, apart from meaning energy, can also mean breath, mood, mind, the essence or essential nature of something, also the spirit. So if we put Rei and Ki together, and both can mean the essence or the spirit of something, it's like saying spirit, spirit, or essence, essence. And we get this tautology, which is common in early Japanese and Chinese prior to that, to imply this kind of the repetition of meaning, even through characters that are not the same, can imply a kind of deepening. If anyone is a third degree practitioner, you might know about a symbol, tool, or mantra where we have two characters together that both mean light, and that also expands the meaning. So we get this same kind of tautology. And Reiki, therefore, has a lot of layers of meaning, even if we just take it at face value, if we take it to mean something literal. The first time we see in literary Japanese, in like the medieval period, of this combination of Rei and Ki together is, I think, somewhere between 1,000 and 500 years ago. I have to fact check myself there. I'll give myself homework and report back if need be. And it was originally an expression that referred to the kind of mysterious quality that you experience when you enter sacred space. And sacred space is also something that deserves to be in air quotes, because all space is sacred if only we tune into it. Other ways that we might see this rendered throughout different eras in Japanese history, it could mean soul energy, mysterious power, a mystical presence, a wondrous or awe-inspiring, in other words, filling us with wonder, essence. Generally, it might just mean the ambience or aura of a place. You walk into a club and you like the vibes, those vibes are its reiki. But in early 20th century Japan, we start to see an exchange, a transnational exchange of ideas. Western ideas are being imported into the country, actually starting the century prior, during the Meiji Reformation. And there's this like boom of spiritual topics that become super popular, particularly things like the New Thought movement, the theosophical doctrines, and things that are influenced by them, these kind of pseudo-Indian and pseudo-Tibetan texts that are written mostly by white scholars under assumed names, that are writing about prana and life force, but there's no direct translation of the word prana. So you find some of these texts being imported from places like North America and England, in Japan, that use the word Reiki in place of prana. They also use the expression Reiki Ryoho to describe kinds of energy healing. Now, the word Reiki Ryoho is a compound word that had existed longer than that just meant Reiki healing method. So soul energy healing method, wondrous energy healing method. But it would be in 1922 that we end up with one specific branch of practice called Usui Reiki Ryoho, or Usui's Reiki healing method. Usui, of course, being the family name, the equivalent of our surnames or last names. And he names it this to differentiate it from other practices that might have similar sounding names. And it is a one-of-a-kind, unique practice. He tells us in the few precious words we have written by him, there is a little document called the Kokai Denju Setsume, or the Explanation of Public Teaching, where Usui Sensei describes that his practice never existed before. It came to him accidentally. He wasn't seeking it out. It just happened while he was practicing asceticism on a mountain. And he doesn't tell us what the nature of that practice looked like. And then he says he acquired this mysterious ability to heal. And that's about all he says on the subject of where it comes from. He, postulates some ontological claims, which are above and beyond, I think, the scope of what we can handle here. But then our new practice is born. And because linguistically, the Japanese language, when spoken out loud, can sometimes be vague. You have a lot of words that are pronounced in very similar ways, and also because it's a culture of reverence, of honorifics, of long titles. This isn't even the entire name of our practice. This is Shinshin Kaizen Usui Reiki Ryoho, or the Usui Reiki healing method to improve the heart, mind, and body. The good news for us, who may not be fluent in Japanese, myself included, far from it, is even in 1920s Japan, this was considered a mouthful, and would often be abbreviated. So we find expressions that are shorter versions of it. Reiho, meaning soul method or spirit method. We also find Reiki Ryoho, or Reiki healing method. And nowadays, one of the more popular ones in Japan is Reiki-ho, or the Reiki method. So our first myth we're debunking is that Reiki means universal life force. Reiki means a whole lot more, which is, neither good nor bad. It just is what it is, and it's hard to render that whole dissertation we just had in a couple short words. And so our glosses are useful. They're meaningful ways to communicate complex ideas. But it is a little bit of a misnomer to say that Reiki literally means, or can be translated as, universal life force. Reiki, I think, is the life force of the whole universe. If it is this awe-inspiring quality made manifest in all parts of creation, Usui himself says that there is nothing in the universe, without exception, that does not possess Reiki. Or maybe said another way, all things in the universe, without exception, possess Reiki. This crystal sphere, this tube of chapstick, my shirt, the air I'm breathing, the water I'm drinking, of course, the human body, the human heart, the human mind. Reiki is in all things, everywhere, all at once. And the practice that we call Reiki in English is Reiki Ryoho, or the Reiki healing method, is the ability to surrender to this indwelling spirit of Reiki, of learning to harmonize the inner Reiki with the Reiki of the cosmos. And it is through that we achieve these miraculous, from Rei meaning miracle or awe-inspiring, qualities.
Nicholas, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Can you turn up the volume on your side a little bit? Some people are having a hard time hearing, and I tried turning up my volume thinking that would help, but it doesn't. I think you have to turn up yours.
Sure. My input levels are a little higher. Is this better for folks?
Hopefully so. So please let me know in the chat. I know Elaine, you were one of the ones, and Celeste. So go ahead, Nicholas, because
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
yes,
And thank you for letting me know. So testing. Are we better for the most part?
yes,
Excellent.
everybody's
Thank
happy.
you.
Thank you.
All right. So there is myth number one. I think the next myth I'd really like to dive into is the myth of Japanese exceptionalism, or maybe we could say the myth of Japanese centrism, where we focus the entire history of Reiki on Japan. There is a really fascinating talk that Justin Stein once gave that talks about the invention of traditional Japanese Reiki. Now, of course, there are traditions of Reiki in Japan that never left Japan. So we do have things that we can consider traditional Japanese Reiki. In fact, in Japan, they have an expression for this. They just call it Dento Reiki, a word that means tradition or traditional. But Reiki, as all people around the world know it, is the result of an exchange of ideas through what the scholar Dr. Justin Stein refers to as the North Pacific Network. We don't get Reiki as we know it without the opening of Japanese borders in 1868 during the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. So for those who don't know, prior to this point in Japanese history, for centuries, trade with foreign nations was pretty much prohibited, particularly Western nations. Western things were generally kind of frowned upon and thought of as impure or inferior or antagonistic to the fabric of Japanese society. The political power was kind of divided and fractioned, and the imperial family did not have any of it. And it was in 1868 that Emperor Meiji, the Meiji Tenno is like an honorific term we give to the emperor, Lord, more or less means like Prince of Heaven, or celestial ruler, that we get this centralization of Japan's political power, a unification of parts of Japanese society, and a rapid modernization throughout all aspects of Japanese culture. That meant the introduction of non-West or non-Japanese ideas and medicine and technology and infrastructure. And so during this time of intense modernization, Japan was importing a lot of things from outside. And some of them were good and useful things, photography and modern medicine and rail systems and all kinds of other great things would have been a result of this. But we also see that there are philosophies and spiritual ideas and social reform coming from Western sources. And one of the clearest examples of something originally stemming from a Western practice that we have entrenched firmly in our Reiki culture is something so near and dear to my heart that I say it out loud every day. And I suspect if I went through and got a peek at everyone's Reiki practice rooms, should you have them, I might find evidence of this. In fact, I can see it over Margaret's shoulder, and that is the Gokai, the 5 precepts. So believe it or not, the 5 precepts are derived from the New Thought movement. So the New Thought movement is kind of an offshoot of this time in we'll say Western spiritual development, Western esotericism, Western occultism, that focuses a lot on the power of the mind to heal, the kind of centrality of the mind and spirit, and how the primacy of spirit over matter. So if we can make changes at the immaterial, then we can expect to see changes at the material level. This is also echoed in things like the Christian Science tradition and a lot of the modern New Age movement. These are really core tenets that a lot of us experience outside of Reiki. But there is this book that was published in 1914 by one of the biggest proponents of the New Thought movement in Japan. His name was Dr. Suzuki Bizan. And Suzuki Sensei wrote this book called, I want to say it's Kenzen no Genri, or the Principles of Health, Principles of Soundness. And one of the core documents in this book is a little poem that he calls a path to well-being, or a path to soundness, a path to health. It's hard to render this quite literally. And in it, he has 5 little bits of advice for us that more or less translate to just for today or today only. Don't be angry. Don't be grievous or fearful. Practice gratitude. Be diligent in your work or work honestly, and be kind to other people. And that sounds really curiously like what we have in Reiki, which is Kyō dake wa ikaru na shinpai suna, kansha shite gyo hagemi hito ni shinsetsu ni. Today only, anger not, worry not, practice gratitude, work with diligence, work with humility. You could render it both ways, and be kind to people. The Japanese side by side is not identical, but the spirit of them is the same. So if Suzuki Bizan's work comes straight out of the New Thought movement, which got into Japan via North America, then we can safely say that the Reiki precepts, which are modeled after this poem, as well as several other sets of precepts that other spiritual schools used that are remarkably similar to the Reiki principles themselves, are also influenced by non-Japanese sources. So Usui Reiki Ryoho has always been at the cutting edge of the intersection, the exchange, the interplay of nations and cultures and languages and practices. It has never belonged only to one group of people. And so there is this myth that we have to strip Reiki of all of its non-Japanese trappings. And if we do that, we lose the precepts, which are the heart and soul of the practice. We're going to lose some ideas about the I don't want to say hierarchy or chain of command, but the force of transmission through these kind of successive ranks. Yes, that is a very Japanese, esoteric Buddhist kind of way of doing things. It's also used in secular arts in Japan, but we find similar structures in like secret societies, which were really popular in North America at the time and remain, a kind of staple in the world today, Freemasonry and similar kinds of things. So from the beginning, Reiki has always been more than Japanese. Of course, it is absolutely Japanese. It was born in Japan. A Japanese man brought it forward, but he was well learned. He was well traveled. His memorial stone tells us that he studied the doctrines of several religions, including several not regularly practiced in Japan, at least early in his life. That he studied modern psychology and phrenology and lots of other things that we don't maybe see outright in the Reiki system. But it's always been in this kind of Venn diagram in the middle where East and West kind of collide, and it creates this beautiful melting pot of praxis. So when Reiki was brought outside of Japan and transmitted to North America, we know that one of the important figures in this transmigration was Hawayo Takada, a student of Hayashi Chujido, whose teacher, of course, was Usui Sensei, the founder. And she's often credited with westernizing the practice of Reiki, but something that I've heard Dr. Stein talk about a bit in a couple of recent interviews that really aligns with some of the things that I've seen as well, is that she actually had to re-Japanify parts of the practice. If we look at her translations, her glosses, because they're not literal translations of the Reiki precepts, she adds things like honor your parents, your teachers, your elders, because that's just normal Japanese society. So to ensure that that is endemic to the practice of Reiki outside of Japan, she has to codify it in one of these precepts, and ensures that element of Japanese culture is transmitted in Western Reiki. We also see in like her early praxis, her early teachings, when some of her earlier students were interviewed by researchers like Hirano, Dr. Hirano and Dr. Stein, that they don't talk about universal life force, but they talk very much about the energy of the universe itself, of this invisible power, chikara no mionai, like unseen forces, and that is a really interesting thing, that she was able to keep this through line of Japanese culture and always ensure that it connected with her audience, whatever their language was, whatever their cultural, religious, spiritual, social, economic background. She was able to do that. And I see in the chat now, the precepts being related to the Meiji Emperor. This is actually a really good tie-in. I know we'll save some Q&A for later, but it caught my eye. And the reason that the precepts were linked to the Meiji Emperor comes from how difficult it is to translate the memorial stone. So in the year or so after Usui passed away in 1926, some of his elder students, his successor in the organization that he founded in particular, created this massive memorial stone. If you get a chance to go to Saihoji in Tokyo, definitely go see it. Be well behaved, but go see it. And it's written in very, very formal, very archaic language. And even people who are familiar and are fluent and are raised in Japan today, and therefore know modern Japanese, they can have difficulty translating this. And so there are a few folks who did early translations, chiefly Frank Orjeva Petter in his book, Reiki Fire, and some of the subsequent ones, a joint book that he did with Walter Lubeck and William Lee Rand. Also, Phyllis Furumoto, Takata's granddaughter, I recently learned, had her own independent translation made, and all of these folks came to the same challenge with the language, where describing the heart and soul of the Reiki practice, there is a kind of statement about Usui's reverence for the Meiji Emperor and the use of his poetry, followed by a statement about how important the Reiki principles are. But because the grammar, syntax, and essentially lack of punctuation are in this document, it makes it sound like it's all one thought, but it's actually just two ideas in succession. And so lots of people trying to translate this very archaic and very formal document came to the conclusion that the precepts themselves were taken from the Meiji Emperor. Orjeva Sensei, one of my teachers, is very, very public about how we all got this wrong, himself included. The first one to put it in print in Western languages, German and then English. He admits to being part of the reason that the zeitgeist today seems to think that the Meiji Emperor is the source of these Reiki precepts. There's actually some evidence that suggests that the Meiji poetry although important in Usui's lifetime, may have become even more important in the period immediately following his death. And some of the folks who kind of broke off from his organization and did their own thing went into like the really nationalistic territory and put even stronger emphasis on the Meiji Emperor. And some Japanese friends of mine find that those writings are like uncomfortable to read with the 21st century eye because of how ultra nationalistic they were. This is the lead up to the Pacific War, World War II. So, society had some different ideas then than it does today. But Usui took these concepts he surely saw elsewhere, adapted them to the Reiki practice, and gave us this as kind of the roadmap, the heart and soul of what we do in the system of Reiki. And another myth that actually kind of threw me for a loop last year. I've been a Reiki practitioner since 2006. I consider myself a perennial student. I'm never done learning. And last fall, a book was translated from Japanese into English for the first time, and it's called Gendai Reiki Ho. It is by Hiroshi Doi, not to be confused with another of his books, Iyashi no Gendai Reiki Ho, or A Modern Reiki Method for Healing. This book, which is temporarily out of print, I'm hoping it comes out again in English soon. It is available in Spanish and in Japanese, but it was first published in Japan in 2011, which is, I think, like 15 or so years after his first book was published. And there are some footnotes in it that tell us some things that I was not prepared for. So we have this myth about the origins of the Reiki symbols. In fact, we have several myths about the origins of the Reiki symbols, depending on who you ask and at which point in history we're looking at it. There is, of course, Tagata's parable about the symbols appearing to him on the mountaintop. There are other versions of this where it says that he discovered them in Buddhist sutras and Sanskrit sutras, or Tibetan sutras, again, depending on the narrative that people have spun or learned or transmitted on purpose or by accident. And then we later get the idea that the symbols are intentionally added to the system of Reiki, and that They're clearly chosen from segments of Japanese culture. And while that is technically true, it is not necessarily Usui who added our 3 second-degree symbols to the system of Reiki. We learned from Rika Sarahashi's excellent translation that Usui only taught 1 symbol. In the 4 years that he taught the practice of Reiki, he only used 1 symbol, and he only introduced it to students who really had need for it. It was not something he found all of his students needed in all circumstances. But when people had difficulty performing what's called enkaku chiryō, or remote healing, in other words, long distance healing, like we learned in the 2nd degree, he had a tool to provide to them. And that tool was kind of like training wheels to help you achieve the level of consciousness or achieve the kind of internal coherence that allows you to perform that task, to hold space in that unique way. And so not all of his students needed it. So not all of his students learned. But in the 2nd presidency, so that would be during Ushida Sensei's term as kind of at the helm of the organization, that one was kind of, we'll say, universalized in the curriculum, and 2 more were added. Rika's translation, I think, is chosen very cautiously. It does not say Ushida Sensei added them himself, only that they date to his presidency. I suspect that might mean we don't really know who said, hey, let's do this. But like all organizations with boards of directors, I am sure at some point a committee was involved in approving these things. And today, the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai doesn't even refer to these 3 techniques as symbols. They call them hiho, which means secret methods, because they are just that. They are secret methods that are transmitted only when you have the requisite amount of experience, initiation, and training to learn to do them. And Doi Sensei, who wrote these books, and a few others that are sadly not available in English yet, he regards them as training wheels, as stepping stones for kind of attaining or embodying the meaning of the symbols. I suspect that might be the kind of attitude about them in the Gakkai as well. Can I prove that? No, because anyone who is currently a member of the Gakkai isn't allowed to talk publicly about the goings-on of the society. They may or may not be able to provide accurate historical context up to a certain point, but as far as like the present day, there's not a lot we can learn unless you move to Japan, are fluent in Japanese, happen to run into someone who's a member, who wants to introduce you to the board, who can then vote on whether or not to admit you, and then you can begin to learn whether or not you know anything about Reiki. You have to start as a beginner. And it's a long and slow process, but under the current presidency, they have actually admitted at least 2 Western folks who are, technically no longer active members because they no longer live in Japan. But it is amazing to see that there is that growth, that acceptance, that willingness to have interplay across those perceived barriers of language and culture. A really great kind of tie-in to this is the myth related to Hawayo Takada, that she wasn't allowed to learn Reiki because she wasn't from Japan. And this is one where it's hard to come to a conclusive idea about the timeline of this, because we have evidence that is kind of scattershot. But if we take like our main points and we kind of plot a trajectory through it, there is a newspaper article from the 1930s that suggests that her first kind of study in Reiki was called a Tsushin Koshu, or a correspondence course. In other words, before she could actually sit down in front of a teacher and learn, she learned by mail, because we didn't have any other form of distance learning then. I suspect this probably was not a formal kind of transmission, but maybe was about background in the system of Reiki. There are some scholars who contest whether or not this is an accurate portrayal of how she learned. But she actually met other Reiki practitioners in Hawaii before she became a Reiki practitioner herself. There were at least 3 students of Hayashi Sensei already living in her area of Hawaii. And probably through them, she would be able to find out more details about the Hayashi Reiki clinic and institute, the Kenkyukai, which is a word that means like learning society or learning institute, and would eventually go and learn directly from Hayashi Sensei. And now there's this idea, okay, so she moves in, she lives with him, she becomes a practitioner in his clinic, she becomes his uchideshi, which is a word that kind of means like apprentice, means like inside student. It's a close family friend, but is there any resistance to her taking Reiki outside of Japan? Well, again, Reiki didn't start only with ideas from inside Japan, so I think there was probably less resistance than one might imagine. In Hayashi's farewell address in 1937, I think it is, he's come to visit Hawaii Takata, has spent months with her and her family, kind of, repaying the favor of her staying with him, and together they taught a bunch of classes, initiating more than 350 practitioners in Hawaii of all kinds of origin. It says that there are the Japanese community, the Chinese immigrant community, the indigenous Hawaiians, and white occupiers, all of which learned Reiki from them. After these months of back and forth, they actually create a branch of his institute. There are several branches in Japan spread out throughout the islands there, but they create an official branch of the Hayashi Reiki Institute in Hawaii in the 1930s. And Takata becomes more or less the resident initiator, the resident, what we call Reijusha, which means Reiju person, Reiju giver, and the resident instructor or Shihan. So I think Hayashi was probably pretty keen to see Reiki in the hands of folks who were committed to it, irrespective of where they lived. And we do have some evidence that some of Takata's early students after World War II would go back to Japan and meet up with Hayashi Sensei's wife, who then became president after his passing, Hayashi Chie, and would learn additional training from her, which is pretty darn phenomenal. So it's always been about exchange. It's always been a back and forth and never just this kind of single direction. Dr. Stein does a really good job of talking about these kinds of episodes in Reiki history in his book. More on that in a few moments. I've got a resource guide for you all. There's also a wonderful book called Women in Reiki that was published in the last few years that has some great stories about some of these important figures in Reiki history. Folks like Hawaii Takata and Hayashi Chie, or Dr. Hayashi's wife. We've got several women from the Yamaguchi family, and the one and only woman president of the Usui Reiki Society, the original society founded by Usui Sensei, and that is Koyama Kimiko. So it's a fabulous book. I don't know how we're doing on time here. But I want to make sure we do have space for Q&A.
Yeah, we have about 40 minutes.
Thank you. Okay. So I think I'll keep rambling for about 10 or so, and then we'll do maybe 25, 30 of Q&A and see where we go from there. So let's pick one more persistent myth in the system of Reiki. Gosh, now that I'm on the spot and I have to pick only one. So let's talk a little bit about one more layers to the symbols, because I'm on a roll. I just come out of a long format second degree training. I'm about to go into third degree training, and we talk a lot about symbols and their use. What is the idea about where they do come from? If they didn't appear to him on the mountain, if he didn't find them in the sutras, if he might not have added them to Reiki himself, where do we get these second degree symbols? Well, we can safely rule out the idea that any of them came from Sanskrit texts, especially because one of them is written in Japanese. You can't have a sequence of 5 Japanese characters, 5 Chinese characters, because they were functionally the same up till some point in history, that is found in a Tibetan or Sanskrit text, because they did not write with those characters. We do have one of the 3 that is based on a Sanskrit seed syllable, what we call bonji in Japanese, which more or less means like Buddhist letter or Buddhist writing. But it is not like a 1-for-1 substitution. It's not identical, and that's purposeful because Reiki is non-religious. If we took a religious symbol and had to use it in the system of Reiki, we would have to be doing something religious. So it was secularized. Much like the teachings from the New Thought movement might have been adapted to be specific to our Reiki practice, although they might be conspecific with several other practices out there. He put them in his own words. He made them meaningful to Reiki practice. He contextualized them, and that context is important for symbols, as we talk about a lot in the second and third degree. Another one of the symbols, also probably derived from a kind of fancy calligraphic writing. There's some debate over which kanji or which character it really comes from. There are several really good ideas, and I will just say that the scholars do not agree. And that is our first symbol, which many of us will know has a kind of spiraling form to it. And that spiraling form comes from a way of writing things in cursive, a very, very special way of doing that, although it is further stylized in our Reiki practice, so it's no longer legible as a character, and therefore is hard to know which one exactly it came from. But it embodies a concept that is really well expressed in Shinto. So we have one character that definitely is, we'll say, Buddhist inflected. It's no longer Buddhist, it's secularized. So we have another one that is Shinto inflected. Now, Shinto is the native religion of Japan, sometimes thought of as kind of like the folk religion, the indigenous practice that got, we'll say, organized a little bit better over time. There's no central doctrine. There's no written literary kind of dogma. There's no unifying body. There's no pope in Shinto. So it's all about regional variation in practice and focuses on things like harmony and connection and purity. Ritual purity is a big part of it. And while these are definitely influences in Reiki, because they are influences on Japan at large, we don't have to know anything about Shinto to practice Reiki. We don't have to be Shinto practitioners, but this first symbol does in fact seem to be strongly inflected from those roots. Now, one could also argue that it'd be kind of silly to find something that embodies a Shinto practice in a Buddhist sutra. But what about this pesky third symbol, the one that Usui himself is known to have shown to at least some students? It's written in a way to make it very hard to read, but is in fact 5 distinct characters. And if we are literate in classical Japanese, which up to a certain point was identical when written to classical Chinese, we can read it as a sentence. I'm not literate in classical Chinese, Japanese, so I have to go on the authority of folks who are much more learned than me. But we get this kind of 5-character sequence, and they're smushed together, so they start to overlap with one another to create kind of like a single line of calligraphy. We can almost write it without having to move the brush much at all, lift it off the paper and put space in between like we would for traditional writing. And that kind of stylized overlapping orthography makes it really useful for certain esoteric arts. And you can find an almost identical sequence of characters. And as I say almost, because a couple small brush strokes can change the meaning. And I'm still trying to find an original document and help translating an original document and not something that samples something that is translated into English. But very likely, this style of writing, we do know, comes ultimately from Taoism, and was popularized in a lot of both secular and spiritual arts in Far East Asia. In particular, the art of ninjutsu, the art of the ninja, and something called onmyo-do, or a type of we'll say divination. It's almost like feng shui. It's based on like yin and yang and the 5 phases. But onmyo-do also uses kind of stylized sequence of characters. It is possible that this particular sequence of characters was originally meant to be written on paper with the names of the recipient and the, we'll say, practitioner. And when written in a specific way and folded in a specific way, it could build connection or sever connection if you wrote it differently and folded it differently. And so it makes sense that something we use to practice long distance healing would build connection. I'm waiting for stronger evidence about that, but if that is factual, it also seems pretty remarkable that something used by the ninja would be written in a Tibetan Buddhist document thousands of years before the ninja wrote anything down, right? So the Reiki symbols themselves come from things that are, say, well expressed in many strata of Japanese society. If you were to show someone in Japan the second symbol who knew nothing about Reiki, describe how it's used, they'd probably be like, okay. But then if you're like, oh, and by the way, it's related to this motif that they've probably seen in a cemetery, in a temple, maybe on a t-shirt, all of a sudden you're going to see the light bulb go off and they're like, oh, I see why these two things are related, this practice and that theme. So, Usui may not have used all of the same tools and techniques we see in modern Reiki in Japan or outside of Japan, but he probably would have been equally as, if not even more familiar with the source material that these things come from. So Reiki, just like it has always been a product of exchange, it has always been a product of innovation. There are some ideas about how Usui might feel with learning Reiki via distance, with Reiju being done over Zoom, with all these kinds of things. But I'm gonna go speculative here. So I can't prove or disprove how he would feel. It's gonna remain a mystery to us. But there was a specific kind of technology that Usui was very keen on incorporating into his healing practice. And my second degree, my recent round of second degree grads, some of whom are here, are going to know this already. But anyone guess what this newfangled technology that he only recently got access to, or that some folks in Japan only recently got access to, would be? Photography. So he developed a practice called shashin chiryoho, or photographic treatment. The short version, you have a picture of someone, you give that picture Reiki, it helps you connect to them to hold space across distance. The problem with this is a lot of his students, considering that in 4 years he had well over 2,000 of them, a lot of his students would not have had the means to have their picture taken. A lot of the folks that they wanted to treat would never have had their pictures taken just because it was expensive. It was not widespread yet in Japan. And so ways to work around that were innovated. His students started to draw stick figures and label them, or write people's names and birth dates on pieces of paper and give treatments that way. I'm, again, conjecturing here that it's probably in this intermediate phase we see him start to teach people this third symbol, this third secret method, or hiho, as a means of enhancing that connection even when there's no visual link. And so it becomes part of Reiki practice. He was also an innovator. He did some pretty interesting things to give Reiju to objects to send to people who couldn't meet with a practitioner, so they could lay that said object on their body. His student Hayashi is known to have given Reiju to certificates and scrolls that have the Gokai on them. Practice I continue in all of my classes today. And people accidentally discovered this without Hayashi giving them explicit directions. It says, oh, hang this scroll someplace where you want to receive Reiki. Instead, it's hang the scroll someplace respectful, because that's what you do with calligraphy in Japan. People would notice the Reiki radiating off of it. They would do the same for their certificates. We don't have a lot of these primary documents from those early days in existence anymore, because practitioners started to notice, oh, my certificates radiate so much Reiki. I have an aching back or side. Let me just stuff that into my kimono or my yukata. Let me tuck it into the sash of my obi, and that rice paper deteriorates over time. So, these early people that we put up on pedestals as being, the creators and maintainers of unchanging tradition were themselves changing and innovating the tradition. That's not to say all change is good or useful. That's also not to say that all change is bad or unuseful. Change just is change. And the system of Reiki has always been adapted to the needs of the present body. I think if Usui were alive and well today, if he were born into this generation, he might have something constructive to say about learning Reiki via distance. I could also be wrong. He might feel some other kind of way about it. I'm not him. I can't know this for sure. So yeah, that's maybe a good point to pause for some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicholas. So I'm just going to start backwards because it kind of goes along with what you're talking about. Let's see. I just want to make sure I've got. Okay, I'll get to Joanne's in a minute. I'll ask this one first. So Simone Palma asked, so how did Usui receive the original symbols? Her sister went to a place last year. I'm not going to butcher the name, and took a course. It was in Brazil. And while she was at the mountain, she claims to have seen many symbols in the forest.
Yeah, so Japão, that's a Portuguese for Japan. So
thank you.
My pleasure. We know that Usui, his memorial stone, says that he was skilled in a lot of things. One of the particular things it says he was skilled in is this practice of creating what we call jumon, which might be translated as like incantation or spell or formula, but literally it's this art of like overlapping calligraphy to create those like talismanic writing to evoke change. So he studied that outside of Reiki, and that's probably how he created or found the 5 characters that we use together to make that same formula in the long distance healing Jumon, or the long distance healing symbol. I can't prove that he found it in one of these original documents that I'm still trying to track down. I have a citation of an original document in a book by Stephen Turnbull called Ninja. I don't remember the subtitle. But that borrows from a book that was published decades earlier called Ninja no Seikatsu, or like Ninja Lifestyle, and it purportedly gets this very closely related symbol from an even older text. Maybe Usui found it from the same older text. Maybe he came up with his own because they're not identical. Maybe the Western version has evolved independently of the original source material. I also can't prove that. But we know that he studied the art of crafting these kinds of calligraphic formulas because his memorial stone tells us.
Thank you for that, Nicholas. Mary Jane, we'll get to you in just a moment. I want to go through the questions that were submitted first. So Joanne, it's not really a question. She just was making a comment that she finds the history fascinating because she struggles when she teaches level 1 to relay the history in an authentic way. And one teacher told her that history was not important, but being a history buff, she thinks that it's very important for us to know the beginnings. It gives us a more thorough understanding. And I didn't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so, history is, let's start with like when we learn history from places like books. Books are snapshots in time. I will be the first one to tell you there are things in this book that I have written that are no longer considered accurate because new data has been published. I endeavor to one day get a second edition of this, maybe even a third, a fourth, a 25th. If new info keeps coming through and I can keep convincing publishers that it's a smart idea to update it, I will. So we have to, go back to what is our source material, look for contrary evidence. If someone says a really tall claim and doesn't back it up at all, we should think about who does this claim serve the most? Does it serve the person selling the course, writing the book, or does it serve the greater Reiki community? And sometimes it's usually an overlap of the two, right? But I honestly think that Reiki history is important to me because understanding where something has been helps us see the trajectory into the future. And no matter where we learn Reiki, how we learn Reiki, in what context it was taught to us, it all stems from a common source, a common ancestor, the founder himself, which means we all share the same history, at least until the point at which it branched off. And even when it branches in parallel directions, that history is still concurrent. It's still affecting the world. So I think it's a great way to find common ground. It helps me understand why I might do something that looks a little bit different to someone else. That doesn't make me right and them wrong. In fact, it probably means that we're both doing things differently than earlier generations did, but understanding how we got there helps us hold space for the fact that Reiki is a polyvalent practice. In other words, it has more than one set of meanings, more than one set of rituals, more than one set of techniques because of this process of continual adaptation, even within traditional Reiki communities.
Thank you so much for that. So Nicholas, Eileen Anderson said she was taught, going back to the symbols, she was taught that the intention is what matters, regardless how you write the symbol or draw it.
So
That's like when you're giving a treatment, I just want to say, or doing an initiation. That's, basically how I was taught and how I teach my students.
you know, this idea of intention is a very the way we approach it in the modern metaphysical movement at large and how that impacts Reiki comes from the modern metaphysical movement at large, which is not to say that it's wrong. I personally have a belief that if we have a sequence of strokes that spell a sentence, in order for that sentence to have meaning, we should do our best to spell it correctly. And doing our best is what matters here. That, of course, is driven by our intent. But intent and impact can be very different. I can intend to write a quick note to someone that I love, and the impact can be that I misspell all of the words so badly they can't read it anymore, and they don't know the meaning in that message. So where possible, if we can, learn how things are spelled. And if we really think about writing the symbols versus drawing the symbols, that kind of locks into our brain that they have linguistic origins. All four symbols traditionally taught in Western style Reiki, the three at the second degree and the one at the third degree, are all derived from writing. Not all the same writing and not all from the same points in history. But if we learn to spell them accurately, then we understand that the soul of those words, which is a very Japanese concept called kotodama, can be transmitted. I think Reiki is bigger than the symbols themselves. I also think the symbols are inherently empty, which is to say not that they don't mean anything, but they only have meaning inside the container. They only have meaning inside this process of mutual agreement. Reiki as an esoteric art means that the teachings, like the symbols, matter to those who learn the context of them. So of course, different traditions are going to have different ways of spelling them, of drawing them, of writing them. And they will do so by mutual agreement to find meaning in them. If we understand what the earlier meaning might have been, what the earlier orthography, what the sequence of writing them looks like, then we can relate those concepts, or relay those concepts rather, to our current students. So yes, at the end of the day, if you get a stroke wrong, Reiki doesn't care. It really doesn't, because Reiki is in all things. The right strokes, the wrong strokes, it's in your breath, it's in your eyes, it's in the air all around you. But because there is this idea of language, and we can objectively spell something right or wrong, this is one of the only things that we can say could be objectively right or wrong in the system of Reiki, and it's only spelling. Can we accomplish things with misspelled words? Of course we can. And I do understand things like the third symbol, or the so-called master symbol, can be hard to get the muscle memory for, especially when you don't read or write any Japanese. And that's why I think
the Western symbol,
Mhm.
The Hanshas,
Mhm.
the symbol, yeah, Hanshaze Shonen. Because one of my
Exactly.
students was Chinese, and she said this is how they learned how to write, by that symbol.
Yeah, writing in that format it takes skill and practice. So we do the best we can. You can let intention take up the rest, but I think it is something that we owe to the tradition itself to try.
Thank you
Thanks for
so
asking.
They
much.
have,
Thanks.
they have a hard time, but okay.
Thanks. So we have 4 more questions. Nicole, I'm going to end with yours because yours is a great way to end. And I want to make sure that Mary Jane gets her question asked as well. And Val has 3. So I'm going to just start with one that kind of piggybacks on this. Val French wanted to know, did Usui practice attunements to attune students to Reiki? I gather our current attunements were developed later using symbols that were included after his death.
This is such a really fascinating concept, and the scholar who has done the most research on this has not published it in English yet, but he has given a lot of talks in English. So that is Dr. Leah D'Ambrosio, who published this great thesis on the anatomy of the Reiki initiations. And if you read and write Hebrew, you can probably track him down and see if he'll send you the copy published in his university, which is in Hebrew. I do not, so that doesn't help me, but listening to him talk is phenomenal. There is shared DNA in the Reiki initiations or attunements or Reiju or empowerments, or insert the word that your tradition uses here, that we can also compare back to things like kanjo, which is a type of ritual of initiation or consecration that we find in esoteric Buddhism, that we find in politics. It's like used in ancient kingship rituals, is where it actually began in South Asia. It's used in the Japanese cultural arts, things like calligraphy and martial arts and flower arranging, tanayu, or like tea ceremony. And while it is not an identical ritual, if you look at the kind of core things that all versions of Reiju, initiation, attunement, empowerment do in the system of Reiki, they more or less overlap with the purposes and the threefold technique that are used in these esoteric Buddhist empowerments. Another scholar by the name of Dr. Yoyon Yonker wrote a massive book called Reiki, the Transmigration of a Japanese Spiritual Healing Practice. And in it, he details some shared DNA between a couple of other Japanese rituals of transmission or empowerment. So that were very popular and very widespread in Japan during Usui's time, some more religious, some more secular than others, but they all kind of share common roots. And they come from a practice that's called, oh, it's just left my brain, but it's sometimes translated to like mediated spirit possession, which sounds really spooky, and it's not. Often the spirit we're talking about is your innate divinity, but there is a receiver and a mediator, just like in the Reiki attunement or initiation. We have the receiver, the student, and the mediator, who is the Reijusha, the Shihan, the Reiki Master or teacher. So all of this suggests that Usui was familiar with some of these other practices and created his own rituals from them, unique to the system of Reiki. It is believed that Hayashi may have added the symbols to the modern Reiki attunements, and that Takata added the process of levelization, in other words, using a different sequence of ritual techniques or actions in level 1 versus level 2 versus level 3. And if we look at, I have gotten on a limited basis to this, if we look at Reiju used by students in Hayashi's line that never left Japan, and the especially the level 1 initiations or attunements used by some of Hawayo Takata's students, there is so much overlap that it's obvious they come from a similar source. Only in later iterations do we get strong differentiations between the different degrees, with the addition of extra symbols and so on and so forth. I have a colleague who got to talk a little bit about this with Hiroshi Doi. It seems that the Gakkai Mei, through oral tradition, preserve stories that that Usui was fairly freeform in giving Reiju, especially to large groups. He taught over 2,000 people in 4 years of his life. That means he probably didn't spend 20 minutes on every initiation for every single person. If you've got 50 people in a room, you got to make that work. And so there are probably some less formal ways that he did these rituals of empowerment, but even those would share the kind of, we'll say, central DNA or core motifs with some of these other kinds of rituals of empowerment. And it's this kind of information that I go into great depth in when I do my 3rd degree training, my Shinpiden training, like I'll be doing in California very soon, as well as in Massachusetts very soon. So I have a whole manual I've written on these kinds of topics that I give to folks in those classes. And I love this topic so much, but it's a big one. So he used some kind of initiation. It's not identical to what we use today, but there is definitely a chain that we can trace back through it.
Thank you, Nicholas. Okay, so we have about 5 more questions, so I hope we can get through them. Mary Jane, you have a question. It's probably pretty big, so maybe Nicholas, you can pare it down for us. And thank you so much for that segue into your class, because this is one of the reasons, I know you all have lots of questions. This is one of the reasons why you study with Nicholas, either in Massachusetts, or you could go to San Francisco if you're on the West Coast, or even close to the West Coast. That's going to be an amazing class. So yeah, Mary Jane, if you want to, I know you're unmuted. If you want to ask the question, that would be great.
Okay, arigato gozaimasu. This is a great class, Nicholas. I'm a meditation teacher and a Reiki teacher, and I feel that the energy of Reiki is not different from that in advanced meditation practice. And we know that, at least what I think is true, not a myth, is that Sensei said that we should say the precepts while in Gassho, which is a meditation. So what do you say about that? What do you teach about meditation as the underlying source of energy in Reiki?
So let's back this up. I want to do kind of 2 things here. One, I didn't necessarily say this out loud earlier, but this is a good time to come back to this idea of Reiki. Is Reiki a discrete energy, or is Reiki the phenomena that drive the universe? And I think Reiki is actually the latter, because there are a few things that physics tells us about measurable discrete energies that Reiki can't meet the standards of. In fact, it surpasses them. For example, the farther away from the source of an energy, the weaker the signal becomes. We have some really well-documented, peer-reviewed, journal-published studies that show us distance Reiki is as effective as hands-on Reiki. So Reiki can't really be an energy if it's not diminished the further away we get from a source. So Reiki as a phenomenon is probably an easier way to couch it in ways that's going to make everybody happy, but also makes our explanations much wordier. So we will say things like energy to make life easy. So if Reiki is the phenomenon that courses through the whole universe,
Yeah, I'm on with that.
And if it is, functionally this idea of wonderment or awe, Rei means that quality, that awe-inspiring quality, then anytime we tap into that sense, we are experiencing Reiki. That does not mean that anytime we tap into the experience of Reiki that we are practicing Usui Reiki Ryoho, however, and this is where the English language breaks down, because we usually just say Reiki to mean the cosmic phenomenon, our tradition, the hands-on practice, the techniques that we use, and we would have different ways to express all of those things in Japanese. We would say Reiki, Reiki-ho, Usui Reiki Ryoho, to get more and more specific about exactly what we mean. So, Usui Society continues to use Gassho to chant. A lot of the kind of core techniques we see in the so-called traditional Japanese Reiki, which may be more traditional, maybe less traditional from time to time, but they often focus on ideas of mindfulness and meditation. And we see a kind of shift in gears from Reiki in Japan to Reiki outside of Japan. There's a lot of focus on cultivation of our own energy through things like Hatsudeho, which will include our hands in Gassho. It's a sequence of exercises that are used traditionally in Reiki. And we don't see a strong emphasis on these same kind of meditative techniques in Takata's teachings. Instead, she focuses on self-treatment as the form of energy cultivation, where there is much less focus on self-treatment in the Gakkai, or so we believe, much less focus on self-treatment in some other, we'll say, vestiges of Hayashi's teachings as well in Japan. So I think what Takata did is she found a clever way to imbue the meditative art with a hands-on practical goal for her Western practitioners, her Western audience, so we could meet the same outcome through a different sequence of actions. And the beautiful thing is, because Reiki as a cosmic phenomenon is omnipresent, once we learn our practice, once we are initiated into the tradition of Reiki, then it's all Reiki Ryoho. And until we get that initiation, it's Reiki, the cosmic phenomena that we might tap into. There, as Kathleen says, and I love this, there are many doorways into Reiki. Reiju is but one of them. The Gokai are but one of them. The symbols and mantras are another. Our hands-on practice or hands-off practice, as the case might be, is also one. So many doorways into that phenomenon that is Reiki woven through the universe.
Thank you, Nicholas. Lindsay Stephanie is asking, what are your thoughts on the story about the miracles that occurred after Usui received the Reiki and came down from the mountain? Example, he stubbed his toe and it didn't hurt, ate without a stomach ache, and fasting healed a woman's toothache, etc.
This is interesting. So in the 1970s, there is this kind of spurious document that is published and attributed to the then president of the Gakkai, the Usui Reiki Society, called the Reiki Ryoho no Shiori, which more or less means like a guidebook to, or a small booklet of the Usui Reiki Ryoho. It is not the same as the Hikke, the manual students are given that they carry to every session. And it seems that the Gakkai today does not think of this as we'll say a trusted resource. So it's regarded kind of apocryphally, if you will. But in it, there are very similar stories about Usui's miracles on the mountaintop. We know Hawayo Takata taught her version of Reiki history. We could call it an embroidered version of Reiki history. It was very embellished, that had these kind of similar things. And what is interesting is, in the 1970s, Hawayo Takata did something really pivotal. She went back to Japan and taught Reiki. She taught a lot of Reiki over a very small period of time. She taught the first degree. I cannot remember if there's evidence as to whether or not she ever went back to teach second degree. But around the time period she would have finished this, we see this document being published. I am not saying that there is a causal relationship here. I'm only highlighting that these things correlate in time. Takata teaches these same miracles in her embroidered version of Reiki history, and a booklet that is now not regarded very highly by the Gakkai records more or less the same miracles. There are versions similar to this that are told orally in Japan. I cannot tell you if they come from within or without Japan, though. I suspect how widespread they might be, that there are kernels of truth in them. How literal they are, I don't know. But the great thing about something like Takata's version of events, or the version of events in the Shiori, is that we can treat them as poetry rather than fact. And something can be poetic and still be true without necessarily being factual in being true. And I'm not talking about like alternative facts here. I'm talking about the notion that symbols speak to the psyche, to the soul, to our collective consciousness. And maybe the purpose of these stories is not to illustrate a sequence of events that literally took place that are documented, but instead to show us the natural progression of how this practice came into the world. And if we treat it as a teaching parable, if we treat it as poetry, we can kind of unconcern ourselves with how much documentary evidence there is, because we just don't know. We don't know a lot about the facts of Usui's life and his early days of teaching and practicing Reiki. We know almost nothing about the circumstance in which it was discovered or birthed into the world. And after almost 20 years of practice, I've just had to become okay with that. It took a while, most of these almost 20 years, but I'm okay with the fact that we don't really know for sure. And maybe one day we will, but probably we won't. And if we surrender to that not knowing and embrace the poetry alongside the data, we can have a really enriching experience.
Thank you, Nicholas. I love that. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for asking that question. Then Val wanted to know, were the 5 precepts adopted into the Reiki practice by Usui himself, or were they adopted later by other practitioners?
So very short answer here. Yes, they come from Usui. How do we know this? When you see the whole text, there's too much glare, but there's some, it's sitting over my shoulder, and that's Usui watching us as we speak. But it is signed. This is, a modern calligrapher, but the very last line says, Shinshin Kaizen Usui Reiki Ryoho, or the Usui Reiki healing method to improve heart, mind, and body. And then Choso Usui Mikao, from the founder. Choso, we would say Shodai in modern Japanese, but the archaic way, the way he wrote it, was Choso. So it's his words, because he says so.
Yay. Okay. And so 2 really quick questions. Val had one more. Did Usui practice hands-on Reiki? Someone said that he did not touch clients during session.
All evidence that I can find suggests he was a proponent of touch. There were some articles written in the late 20s and early 30s that suggest that more or less from its inception, Reiki was practiced as a hands-on healing method. What is interesting, though, is that Usui mostly practiced with a single hand at a time. Hayashi is the reason that we, as a general practice, always use 2 hands at once. It appears, from what I can gather, I have to read between some lines here, that Usui and the Gakkai in the early part of its history did a single hand unless there were 2 of something you were treating. You might treat both ears simultaneously, both eyes simultaneously, but maybe just 1 hand over the neck or 1 hand over the heart. Hayashi really begins to change this. Hayashi actually does a lot of adaptations that make Reiki more focused on like clinical practice, which is why people assume he was a medical doctor. That's another myth. He wasn't. We'll save that for another day, I guess. Maybe part 2 next year. Yeah, by all accounts, he practiced Reiki as a hands-on art. We can also assume that he practiced it as a hands-on art if he was doing long-distance Reiki, though.
So I just, for clarification, he actually didn't do, like, if he put his hand on someone, he wasn't like, okay, I'm going to put my hand on your heart and heal your heart, and then I'm going to go to your stomach. He just put a hand, like, more as like, okay, Reiki. Like, can you explain that a little further, I guess?
Yeah, so there is so part of like the documents published by his society suggest that probably concurrent with his lifetime, his tenure, probably. We don't really know. I don't have the earliest iteration of this document. I don't know if anyone does, still surviving. There was actually like a Ryohoshishin, like a treatment guide that showed you where was the most advantageous place to treat this condition versus that. So there was an emphasis not only on the spiritual, like self-cultivation and like the road to enlightenment, which was the purpose of Reiki. There was also a therapeutic component that said, hey, if someone has a fever, we're going to suggest treating here, here, and here. Now, his Ryohoshishin looks different than Hayashi's. They seem to come from 2 different models of human anatomy, human energy, human wellness. There are some scholars who suspect that the model published in Usui's society is strongly influenced by like the chiropractic tradition and view of the body, which was all the rage at the time. And some scholars suggest that Hayashi's model is strongly based in Chinese medicine. But they both also taught techniques that were not solely relegated to healing the physical body. In fact, Usui tells us that the goal of Reiki has more to do with the mind, with the heart, we could say, or the spirit. And ultimately, I'm going to paraphrase really badly, but he says, if we can make the mind sound, or make the mind strong, the body will follow. So there is a hands-on component for, the physical, but we should aim to focus on the mind, the heart, the spirit.
I love that. Thank you so much for that clarification. And so we're going to end now with Nicole. Nicole, thank you so much for your patience. Nicole Crouch asked, Nicholas, can you please give a couple good beginner resources on crystals and how crystals enhance Reiki?
Yeah, so, in my life, my Reiki practice and my crystal practices are fairly separate. I mean, they occupy the same space in my life. This is my practice room. My crystal collection mostly lives in here. But I'm not generally someone who uses a lot of hands-on crystal healing with hands-on Reiki, unless someone specifically wants it. And then, of course, I'm here to meet people where they're at. There are some books that focus on like Reiki crystal healing or crystal Reiki healing, whichever way you want to frame that. Krista Mitchell has a book on the topic that I think is pretty decent. There's some others that I think will be more or less satisfying, some with some egregious historical inaccuracies in them. But if you want to learn more about crystals as kind of an overarching practice, I have a whole bunch of books. If you want one that's really beginner friendly, try Crystal Basics, which came out in 2020. It's got a directory of 200 stones in it and lots of hands-on techniques from crystal meditation and layouts and grids. Layouts and grids are really passive things that we can do in our Reiki space that allow us the freedom to simultaneously practice hands-on Reiki while we have these kind of, we'll say, ambient or environmental crystal applications. These days I find myself like fairly organic in the way that I combine these things. One little note, there are 2 known historical precedents for using crystals in Reiki practice in Japan. One is that Usui would specifically take quartz crystal spheres and give them reiju and send them out into the world. I talk about the how and why of this and what I think the reason for spheres specifically would be in my 3rd degree class, because it involves giving reiju or giving initiation, attunement, whatever you want to call it, to the spheres. Hiroshi Doi mentions in this recently translated work that Hayashi's Reiki clinic, before it was a separate institute, when it was still operated as like a branch of the original society, it was a research center. And he researched the application of crystals in Reiki. We don't know what his conclusions were, unfortunately. None of that data is preserved, at least not transmitted in that text. But there are some folks in Hayashi lineages who learned to give reiju to spheres of quartz or other forms of quartz as well. So I suspect he might have copied or learned from his teacher or emulated it in some way.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. So we need to close now. Nicholas, how can people reach out to you or find you if they have more questions or would like to take a class from you?
Absolutely. So I'm going to do 2 things for us. One, let me just quick put up a screen share. Some of us are visual learners. I've got contact information for you all right here, theluminouspearl.com. You can check out the classes tab, check out the books tab, see where I'm going to be. You can reach out to me directly at Nicholas@theluminouspearl, or if you're a social media person, you can find me at theluminouspearl in most places. The other thing that I'm going to do for everyone is when this is over, I have compiled a list of Reiki resources, some recommended reading with good evidence-based Reiki history, understanding, of course, that the more recently it was published, the better the data might be. I will email that out to everyone, also with links to some of these upcoming classes. There are going to be some online resources, free online resources in that same resource guide, because not everyone is a book person. Not everyone wants to go out and buy things too. So I wanted to ensure that all of that was available for you. But absolutely reach out. Join my newsletter if you haven't, because it's a great way to learn more. I'll give details for that in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, so everyone, you're going to be getting, obviously, I always do a recap email on Fridays, but Nicholas has the registration list. So even if you weren't here in person, you're going to get a personalized email from Nicholas, and I'll have his contact information. So thank you all so much. Nicholas, thank you. I have so much gratitude in my heart for you. We were getting so many comments from people about how much they love this. And yes, the recording will be sent out again. And so thank you all so much. Thank you, Val and Lindsay and Simone and Mary Jane and everybody who, Nicole, for sending in your questions as well. It always makes it a much more rich presentation when we have live questions from everyone. So thank you all. Nicholas, again, I know Kathleen's ill, and so I'm not going to make her get on camera, but Kathleen and Kelly and I thank you so much for your generosity in being here today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you everyone for joining, for your engagement, for your questions, your support. Go out into the world and be Reiki.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.